The morning my grandmother died, my mother reorganized the kitchen. I remember standing in the doorway of our house in Mississauga, watching her pull every pot and pan out of the lower cabinets, stack them on the linoleum floor, and start wiping down shelves that were already clean. My grandmother had passed at 6:14 that morning. By 8 o'clock, my mother was alphabetizing the spice rack. I was 31 years old and I had never once seen my mother cry. That detail used to feel like a character flaw. Something I filed away alongside her other edges. The way she corrected my posture at the dinner table until I was 17. The way she referred to my father as your father. Even when speaking directly to him, the way certain questions in our house were answered, not with answers but with a long, flat silence that told you to stop asking. I thought she was cold. For most of my adult life, I thought my mother was simply a cold woman who had produced a warmer daughter through some genetic accident. I know better now, but knowing better did not come easily, and it did not come from her. It came from a cardboard box that arrived at my apartment on a Wednesday in November, 8 months after my grandmother's funeral. It came from a man I had never met who drove 4 hours from a small town in northern Ontario to hand-deliver it to me himself. And it came from a truth that had been sitting in that box in that man's house for 32 years. My name is Annalise. I am 34 now, and I want to tell you what was in that box. My mother's name is Diane. She raised me in the same house she grew up in, a narrow 2-story on a street in Mississauga, where all the driveways are too short and all the backyards smell like cut grass and someone else's barbecue. My father, a quiet civil engineer named Robert, worked long hours and came home to eat dinner at the table with us every night without fail, because my mother believed in dinner at the table every night without fail, and Robert believed in whatever kept the peace. I was an only child. This was explained to me when I asked, as a matter of practicality. My mother had a difficult pregnancy. Her recovery was long. 1 child was the right number. I accepted this the way children accept things that are delivered in a tone that does not invite follow-up. I was good at accepting things. I was good at being small and quiet and not requiring too much. I loved my parents, I think, in the way you love the only landscape you have ever known. Not because it is beautiful, but because it is the only thing you can see from where you are standing. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was a different kind of person entirely. Her name was Eleanor, and she smelled like hand cream and black tea and the particular cedar of the closet where she kept her good wool coats. She had lived alone in her house in Barrie since my grandfather passed when I was 4, and every summer I spent 2 weeks with her, which were the softest 2 weeks of my year. She let me stay up too late. She taught me to play gin rummy. She told me stories about growing up in Cape Breton that made the place sound like something out of a novel. She never talked about my mother's childhood. I noticed this, eventually. I noticed that Eleanor could talk for an hour about her own girlhood, about her sisters, about the church socials and the fishing boats, and the one winter the harbor froze completely solid. But if I asked her about my mother as a girl, she would find something to do with her hands. She would get up to check something on the stove, or remember a phone call she needed to make. I was 12 when I first noticed this. By the time I was 20, I had stopped asking. Eleanor died in February of the year I turned 31. She was 83 years old, and she went quietly in the night in a room at Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre, and by the time my mother called to tell me, it was already over. I drove up to Barrie alone because Robert had a project deadline, and my mother said it was fine, she could manage. She did not need me there, sooner than necessary. I arrived to find her reorganizing Eleanor's pantry. The funeral was small. My mother gave a short eulogy that covered the facts of Eleanor's life with the same efficient competence she brought to everything. Dates, accomplishments survived by. She did not tell us single stories. She did not say what Eleanor's smelled like or what it felt like to be loved by her. I sat in the pew and looked at my hands and thought about gin rummy. Afterward, we cleaned out the house. My mother was systematic about it. She had 4 categories: donate, discard, keep, and 1 box labeled in black marker with my name. She handed me the box without commentary and said it was things Eleanor had specifically wanted me to have. I didn't open it in Barrie. I put it in my car and drove it back to my apartment in Toronto and set it on the kitchen table and did not open it for 3 weeks because I was not ready to be done with Eleanor yet. When I finally did open it, I found what I had expected: the gin rummy cards worn soft at the edges. A small watercolor Eleanor had made of the Cape Breton shoreline. A string of amber beads I remembered her wearing on Sundays. A recipe card in her handwriting for the oatmeal cookies she used to make. A photo of the 2 of us at Wasaga Beach when I was 7. me with a melting orange popsicle and her laughing at something off camera, and at the very bottom, under everything else, a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Eleanor's handwriting. Inside the envelope was a folded note and tucked behind it a business card. The note said, "My darling girl, I have kept this from you longer than was right. The man on this card knows the rest. I am sorry it fell to him and not to me. But some silences go on so long they become their own kind of wall, and I was never brave enough to knock it down myself. Please forgive me. Please find him." The business card was plain white, just a name, Douglas Beaulieu, and a phone number with a 705 area code. No profession, no address. Just the name and the number and the implication that I was supposed to call a stranger and ask him what my grandmother had been too afraid to tell me herself. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that. The amber beads were still around my neck where I had put them when I found them in the box. I sat there until it got dark outside and the streetlights came on through the window, and then I put the business card in my wallet and did not call the number for 6 weeks. I kept the card with me everywhere. I took it out sometimes and looked at it, at the name, Douglas Beaulieu, at the 705 area code, and then I put it back. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. I think what I was actually doing was adjusting to the weight of knowing that a right moment was coming, that after I made that call, there would be a before and an after, and I was not sure I was ready to live in the after. In the end, it was not a deliberate decision. It was a Tuesday evening in April, and I had just gotten off a long video call for work, and I was eating cereal for dinner, and I had the card out on the counter, as I often did in the evenings without quite meaning to, and I called before I had time to talk myself out of it. He answered on the third ring. His voice was steady, unhurried, the way older men sometimes sound when they have had a long time to make peace with things. He said his name when he picked up and I said mine, and there was a pause and then he said, "I wondered if Eleanor had gotten around to it." "Around to what?" I said, though I already knew the shape of the answer. "To sending you to me," he said. "Can you come to Parry Sound?" I drove up on a Saturday. Highway 400 north through Barrie and then west on 69, the highway narrowing and the trees getting closer to the road the farther north you go. That particular quality of Ontario landscape where the rock starts to push through the earth like something trying to remember it exists. I had the address of a house on a quiet street, 2 blocks from the waterfront. I had his name and my grandmother's note, and nothing else. The house was a modest bungalow, well-maintained, with a vegetable garden along the south side that had been put to bed for the previous winter and was just starting to come back. There was a truck in the driveway and a pair of mud boots at the front door. The man who answered when I knocked was in his early 70s. Not frail, not shuffling, not wrapped in a blanket. He was trim and upright and had the kind of tan that comes from actual time outdoors, and he looked at my face when I appeared at his door, the way people look at something they have been picturing for a very long time and are now seeing if the reality matches the image. He said, "You look like her." Then he stepped back and said, "Come in." His name was Douglas Beaulieu, and he had lived in Parry Sound for 40 years, and he had worked as a land surveyor for Parks Canada until he retired at 67, and none of this was the reason my grandmother had sent me to him. None of this was what mattered. What mattered was that he had been engaged to my mother when they were 24 years old. He told me this at his kitchen table, with 2 cups of tea between us and the particular quietness of a house where one person has lived alone long enough to give the silence its own character. He told me he had met my mother in Ottawa, where they were both working after university. My mother in a government office job she kept for exactly 3 years before returning to Mississauga. Douglas on a contract position that had led him, by a series of gradual steps, to Parry Sound and Parks Canada and the life he had built there. They had dated for 2 years and then been engaged for 8 months. He said my mother had been different then. Or maybe not different, maybe just more visible. He said she had a way of focusing on things, on a problem, on a goal, on a person, that made you feel as though you were the only thing in her field of vision, and that when you were young and that focus was turned on you, it felt like the most specific kind of being known. He said the engagement ended in April of the year my mother turned 26. She had ended it. She had returned the ring by mail. Not a dramatic gesture, just a practical one, the way my mother approached most things that were difficult. She included a note that said she had made a decision about the direction of her life, and it did not lead through Parry Sound. He had not heard from her again. He said all of this without bitterness. It had been 32 years, and he had done his own living in the interim, a marriage that had lasted 17 years to a woman he loved genuinely, a daughter now grown and living in Vancouver, a retirement that was quiet in the ways he had wanted it to be. He was not telling me this as a grievance. He was telling me this because it was necessary context for the thing he actually needed to tell me. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at me steadily. 2 months after she ended the engagement, he said, Eleanor came to see me. I set down my tea. She drove from Barrie to Ottawa, he said. She didn't call ahead. She showed up at my apartment on a Wednesday morning, and she told me that your mother was pregnant. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside I could hear the street, a car going past, someone's dog, and inside there was just the two of us, and the thing he had just said. She was already with Robert by then, Douglas said. Your mother. They had been seeing each other for only a few weeks. Eleanor didn't think Diane had told him. She didn't know if she planned to. What she knew was that the timing meant the child was mine. I heard what he was saying. My body understood it before my mind quite caught up. She asked me what I wanted to do, he said. I told her I wanted to be part of my child's life. I told her I would do whatever I needed to do, that I wasn't asking for anything from your mother except the chance to know the child when the child arrived. He paused. Eleanor went home and spoke to Diane. What happened after that, the decision that was made, I only know from Eleanor's side. Your mother refused any contact. She told Eleanor that the child would be raised by her and Robert, and that would be the end of it. She and Robert moved back to Mississauga before you were born. Eleanor called me the day you arrived. She told me your name. He reached across the table and opened the cover of a small notebook that had been sitting there since I arrived, that I had not fully registered until now. Inside the front cover, written in a different ink at what looked like different times, was a list of dates. A date for each of my birthdays, 31 of them, right up through February of the previous year, a few weeks before Eleanor died. She called me every year, he said, on your birthday. She would tell me whatever she knew about you, how you were doing in school, what you were interested in, later on what kind of work you had gone into. She never told me where you lived. She said she had promised Diane she wouldn't cross that line. But she could not make herself stay completely silent. He looked at the notebook. She was not a woman who could stay completely silent about a thing like that. I thought about Eleanor getting up to check the stove every time I asked about my mother's childhood. I thought about how specific that evasion was. Not general discomfort, but a particular closed door that she guarded with both hands for 32 years, while simultaneously calling a man in Parry Sound every year on my birthday to make sure he knew I was still real. I did not cry right away. I sat very still with both hands around my tea mug, and I let it move through me in stages, the way cold water moves through your chest when you drink it too fast. When I finally spoke, I asked the question I had not planned to ask but could not stop. Does she know I'm here? I said. My mother, I don't know, he said. Eleanor told me about 2 years ago that she was planning to write you a letter. She said she wanted to do it herself and she wanted to do it in time. I think she knew she was running out of time. He looked at his hands. I think finding out I had a daughter and then immediately losing the chance to meet her before she was ready, that was something I made my peace with a long time ago. I was prepared to wait. I am still prepared to wait. I am not going anywhere, and I have no expectations of what comes next. I just want you to know that I am here and that you were never forgotten, not for a single year. I stayed in Parry Sound that night. Douglas's daughter, my half-sister, a word that sat strange and new in my mouth, was not there, but he showed me a photograph of her. Her name was Margot, and she had her father's eyes and a smile that was wider than his. He said she knew about me. He had told her years ago when she was old enough to understand, because he believed she had the right to know she had a sibling somewhere. He said she had been waiting for the same phone call he had. I slept in the spare room, which was plain and comfortable, and had a quilt on the bed that smelled like cedar and dryer sheets. I lay awake for a long time staring at the ceiling. Not with grief exactly, though grief was part of it. More with the disorienting feeling of having your own story rearranged around you. All the same facts, all the same years, but suddenly framed differently, the way the same landscape looks like a different place depending on which road you come in on. I thought about Robert, my father, and whether he had known or suspected, or whether my mother had carried this alone for 32 years, beside a man who believed his wife had simply changed her mind about a previous relationship and moved on. I thought about what it costs a person to carry something like that, in a house full of family dinners and school projects and Sunday morning routines. I thought about the spice rack. I think I understood something about my mother that night that I had never understood before. Not forgiveness, that would come later, and it would not come all at once. but something more like seeing a shape in the dark that had frightened you for years, and finally recognizing it as furniture. She was not cold. She was afraid. She had made a choice when she was 26 years old and frightened. A choice that had seemed like the safest possible option, and had calcified over the decades into something she could not revisit without dismantling everything she had built on top of it. She had become excellent at not revisiting things. She had become excellent at being competent instead of vulnerable, at cleaning things instead of feeling them. I am not saying it was the right choice. I am not saying I was not angry. I was angry for a long time, and the anger was real and it was mine, and I did not rush to let it go. But I am saying I recognized something. I met Margot in June. She drove down from Vancouver on a trip she had already been planning, and we arranged to meet for coffee in Toronto, at a place on Queen West that she picked because she had been there before on an earlier visit and liked the light in the afternoon. She was 38 years old and taller than I expected, and she hugged me immediately when she saw me, before we had even said hello properly. She smelled like cedar and something citrusy, and she pulled back from the hug and looked at my face and said, "Oh, I see it. I totally see it." And then she laughed, a wide laugh, the one from the photograph, and something in my chest that had been held very tight for months released a little. We sat in that coffee shop for 4 hours. We closed the place down. She told me about her life, the marine biology research she did, the apartment she had in Kitsilano with a view of the water, the dog she was training, badly, to do tricks. She asked me about my life with the kind of attention that was clearly genetic, because I recognized it, the same quality of focus Douglas had. The way he listened like you were the only thing in the room. She said she had thought about me her whole life. She said growing up with a father who was always a little bit waiting for something had made her curious about what that something was, and when she was old enough to understand, the curiosity had just grown. She had Googled my name periodically over the years, with the guilty feeling of someone doing something slightly forbidden, not to contact me, just to know I was real. "You were real to me even when I couldn't know you," she said, and I thought of Douglas saying almost the same thing, and I thought of Eleanor on the phone to Parry Sound every year on my birthday, and I thought about all the ways people carry what they love when they cannot hold it. I drove home that evening with the windows down even though it was only June, and the evening was still chilly the way Toronto evenings in June can be, that particular Canadian spring chill that has not quite decided whether it's still winter. I did not feel sad. I felt something more complicated and more complete than sad. I felt like a person who has been reading a book and suddenly realizes on page 200 that they misunderstood a crucial detail on page 4, and now the whole story makes a different kind of sense. The conversation with my mother happened in September. I did not confront her. I want to be clear about that because I think the word confrontation implies a kind of warfare that is not what I wanted. I had thought about what I wanted for months by then, and what I wanted was not to punish her or humiliate her or extract a dramatic confession. What I wanted was the truth said aloud between us, acknowledged, made real in the way that only language spoken in the presence of another person can make something real. I drove to Mississauga on a Sunday and my father, Robert, was at a golf thing, which I had not planned but was grateful for. My mother and I sat at the same kitchen table I had grown up eating dinner at, and I put Eleanor's note on the table between us. I put Douglas's business card next to it, and then I sat back and waited. She looked at the note for a long time without touching it. She looked at the business card. When she finally looked up at me, her face was doing something I had never seen it do in 34 years. It was not collapsing exactly. It was more like a wall that has been under pressure for a very long time, finally quietly, admitting that the pressure is there. She said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Since April." She nodded once, slowly. She said, "I thought about telling you myself so many times." I said I believed her. We did not have a single conversation that fixed everything. That is not how it works, and I am suspicious of any version of this kind of story that suggests it is. We had several conversations over the following months, some of them careful, and some of them not careful at all. Some of them ending with one or both of us needing to go home and take some space before we could come back. Robert found out, eventually, and that conversation was between the two of them, and I was not part of it, which was right. He called me a few weeks later and said he loved me and that nothing about that was changed, and I sat on the floor of my hallway and cried for the first time since any of this had started. My mother met Douglas, just once so far briefly, at a coffee shop in Barrie that was not far from where Eleanor's house had stood before it was sold. I was not there for that meeting either. What I know about it is only what each of them told me separately afterward. What I know is that it was not warm, but it was honest. And I know that my mother cried in the car on the way home, which I know only because she told me, and which required something from her that I think it would be small of me not to honor. I see Douglas now about every couple of months. Sometimes I drive up to Parry Sound, and he takes me out in his boat on Georgian Bay, which is cold and enormous and beautiful. And we talk about the things we are learning about each other, the small facts of a person's life that take time to accumulate. He likes old country music and is a careful and skilled cook, and gets too emotionally invested in Toronto Maple Leafs games, which I appreciate because I do too. And we have sat on his couch, watching the same game with the same level of irrational tension, and the word for that experience is something I am still figuring out. It is something warm, it is something that is mine. Margot and I text almost every day. She sends me photos of her dog's failed trick attempts, and I send her photos of the weird things I find at the antique market on Roncesvalles that I visit on weekend mornings when the light is good and I do not want to be inside. We are planning a trip together in the spring. Not anywhere dramatic. Just a long weekend somewhere she has not been and I have not been, somewhere neither of us has a history that we are still figuring out. I still have Eleanor's note. I keep it in the same box as the gin rummy cards and the amber beads and the watercolor of the Cape Breton shoreline. I have read it so many times that I no longer need to look at it to know what it says. But I take it out sometimes anyway, because her handwriting looks like her, and I am not done missing her. I think about what she did, and I do not know entirely what to make of it. She kept a secret that was not hers to keep. She kept it for 32 years. But she also stayed in contact with Douglas for 32 years, quietly maintaining a thread between my life and his, so that when the time came, the thread was still there. She was not brave enough to cut through the wall herself, but she kept a door in it. She left me the key. I think that is the most honest thing I can say about any of this. The people in my life who love me have not always known how to show it clearly. They have shown it in difficult, indirect, sometimes maddening ways, in spice racks alphabetized by grief, in birthday phone calls to a man in Parry Sound, in a business card left at the bottom of a box of gin rummy cards. But they showed it. It was always there, legible, if you knew what you were looking at. I am 34 years old, and I live in a bachelor apartment in the East End of Toronto that I am slowly making into something that feels like mine. I have a half-sister who makes me laugh until my face hurts. I have a father who is alive and specific and learning me the way I am learning him, neither of us in a hurry. I have a mother who made a choice at 26 that she spent 32 years trying to protect, and who is now slowly, in her particular competent way, trying to make room for the thing she protected everyone from. I have Eleanor's handwriting in a box on my shelf. What I thought for most of my life was a house of silences was really a house of doors. It just took me 34 years and a stranger's business card and 4 hours of coffee with a woman who has my father's eyes to finally understand where they led.